Hey, it's Paul K. And this episode of Wine Talks is about me. That's right. It's about me and what I know and how the stuff is really great. It's really great. Everybody's really great. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the guests I've had on the show and what it means in the wine trade. Just for fun, this is part of my set. I'll show you around. This is the Wine Talk set you see on the show. You can see the fancy lighting up there. And then I've got neon signs everywhere. I like to collect neon. Real neon, like cool neon. No beer signs. I don't collect beer signs. I only collect artifacts from movies. I've got many pieces of neon, really cool pieces that have been in a TV show or movie or whatever. They're large. This particular one back here says Bordner's on it, and Bordner's is a bar in Hollywood. And the movie, they made a movie. They used it as a set, and they made the sign for the set. So anyway, that's not why I'm talking. I've had some amazing podcasts recently, and we'll go over a few of them because I wanted to have this conversation to talk about the essence of this industry and the connections that occur in this industry like no other. It's not by accident. It's by history. It's by DNA of what wine is, despite some of the innovations and some of the attempts to innovate, which is fine. I think innovation is great. I have a niece, for instance, who's launched a salad dressing called Lav, L-A-V, and you'll see it on TikTok, and she's got some great sales volume coming her way because of the innovation of the packaging that she's using for her dressing. And there's two reasons I brought that up. One is the innovation. The other is the marketing, which clearly in the wine trade takes some innovation and experimenting. The difference is we don't have the tons of margin to work with in order to make too many mistakes when we're innovating our marketing attempts. But that's a different conversation. I'm going to start with the one I just had. She just left. Her name is Lisa Kay. She's a young Enology student in Cornell University. And part of her, if you listen to the podcast that comes out in a week or two, part of her ambition and inspiration to be in this industry came right here on this set. She was the writer of my talking points for podcasts early on in the history of this podcast, as whenever there was a woman winemaker in. And so I wanted a young girl to write the talking points and get inspired by these conversations. So inspired that she became an enology student at Cornell University. She's going to her third year. And that alone has created amazing contacts in the world for her and for me, actually. It turns out that one of her professors, Gavin Sachs, who has been on the show, and we have this amazing relationship because, at least a friendly relationship because of that I would have never had if it wasn't for this industry and for this inspiration by her. But she recently returned from a 6-week internship, stagiaire, in Chateau Aubay in the Pessac-Léon region of Bordeaux, France, on the left bank. And wow, the connections and the relationships that we didn't even know we had surfaced during this conversation. And the reason that this even started was I had a wonderful conversation with Chateau Aubay, the directrice, Veronique Sanders Van Beek, and she sat with me at the Chateau. Great podcast. You want to listen to it? And we had an amazing conversation, and I'm going to start sharing some of those reels. Well, that evolved into having a conversation with Lisa about her ambitions for an internship, and then eventually she ended up there for 6 weeks. And you should see the glee and the inspiration and the humility exhibited by this young college student to talk about what she learned in Bordeaux, France. I don't know that you get that when you study microchips or anything other than something that connects to the human soul like wine does. So that's coming out. Just prior to that, I had the same day, actually today, I did 2 podcasts today, with the Cladstrups in Paris. The Cladstrups wrote the famed book, Wine and War. They also wrote a book on the region of Champagne. They also wrote the book Champagne Charlie, a story of Charlie Heidsieck, which has a lot to do with American history, frankly. And they just finished a book called Eugénie, the Last Empress of of the famed Emperor Napoleon III, the great nephew of the famed general Napoleon Bonaparte. And wow, what a story. And the book is coming out, it came out July 5th. It's on Amazon. You can get an audiobook too. And one of the most seamless books. History books sometimes can get to you with the details and sort of like just ad nauseum. And this book read so well. What was cool about it, and I discussed this on the podcast with the Cladstrups and this is an American couple that's lived there for 40 years. Don Cladstrup was the ABC European correspondent for 40 years. And so they've got a wonderful grasp, of course, of English and then of the French culture. But when you go to Paris, what's cool about this book, if you go to Paris, you see Eugénie all over the place, not as a picture, not as a painting, not as a statue, of her influence on how that town sits, how it flows, what you see, the architecture. So much of it came from Eugénie and her husband, Napoleon Bonaparte III. Wine history with her. The town Biarritz, which is down in the south of Bordeaux, which has an amazing castle, chateau-esque hotel. That was her house that she designed. But that's not even the point. Her influence on French culture, from fashion to the layout of the land to poverty, was so impactful. And then what happens? She gets blamed for the Franco-Prussian War defeat, and she gets exiled to Spain and lives her life out in exile, though she created Paris in the sense of what we see today. And what's cool about this book is you could read the book and go to Paris and go, wow, look at what she did, because you'd recognize everything. Or you can have been to Paris many times and read the book and go, oh yeah, I know what she's talking about. That's how cool the book is and the way she explains what's going on. And the Cladstrups, the most famous book, the Wine and War book, is a must read, in my opinion, for anybody in the wine trade. Anybody must read this book because it explains so much about the history of wine. And so why is that so interesting, besides just the history of it? Well, Eugénie would stop at Chateau Giscourt on the way to Bordeaux, on the way to Biarritz through Bordeaux. Okay. Well, what's so interesting about that? Well, the directrice of Chateau Aubay, her husband, Alexander Van Beek, runs Chateau Giscourt. So if you go to Chateau Giscourt and you hear the history of Giscourt, they talk about Eugénie and how she stopped there. Okay, well, big deal. Well, Eugénie's like the most unsung hero of Paris in French culture. And that was part of the concept with the Cladstrups, was to discuss this woman who had so much influence over what France is today and no one's ever heard of. And so that's a really good story to hear. I had a conversation with Maximilian Riedel. In fact, he was in town in Los Angeles last week, and I got to go visit him in his hotel. And we sat down for a 40-minute conversation about glassware and the history of glassware and its impact on wine. So you want passion and inspiration from somebody in the generation in their industry and their trade, you got to listen to Maximilian. And you will have a whole nother scope and viewpoint of not only what glass does when you hold a glass of wine or crystal, but the history of that. How it came about, what the idea between a glass that's been designed to showcase Cabernet versus the glass that's been designed to showcase Chardonnay. They're different glasses. And some people ask, like, really? Like the first question, I was having dinner the night before I had the conversation with Maximilian, and my friend said, really, does it make a difference? And if it does, why? So that was my first question to Maximilian. And it's hard to explain, and you'll have to hear the podcast, but at the end of Sideways, the movie Sideways, and I don't know if you know this about the movie, but the character, he disses Merlot, and it became this big thing in the wine trade. In fact, when I was selling wine at that time, Merlot plummeted in sales, and Pinot Noir went through the roof. You couldn't even find Pinot Noir to buy at a reasonable rate. That's changed already. And Merlot was a noble wine, and a noble grape was just disastrous sales volume because of this movie. Well, at the end of the movie, he sits with a bottle of Chateau Cheval Blanc. Well, Cheval Blanc at that time was predominantly Merlot. And so the irony of the movie is that the final scene is he's sitting in this diner with a hamburger and a tumbler, like a plastic tumbler, amber tumbler of one of the most famous wines in the world. You know, if you knew the answer, if you knew that, you would say, well, that's interesting. Wow, what a how ironic. But the point being, if you taste a wine, you take two wines and you put it's the same wine, If you put it in a plastic tumbler and you put it in one of Maximilian's glasses and you smell them, you get different sensations, though molecularly and the atoms of the wines are exactly the same. They're from the same bottle. But it does change the perception of what you get, and it brings out the wine. And this is an important feature of what glassware, proper glassware does. And does that exaggerate the aristocracy of wine? I mean, maybe to some people, but until you do it, then you realize, well, this is really cool. This really changes stuff. And so when you have a conversation with Maximilian, you get that passion about the legacy and the history and what he's trying to do to the world of wine. And he's obviously younger than me, but he's traveling the world all over to share these stories, to share the passion. And that's what it takes in our trade to do that. The last one I want to talk about, two of them actually. I had, and again, going to the connections in this industry and what happens when you travel and what happens when you get a chance to use wine as a vehicle for travel, and enotourism is big right now. And so I had Bill Callejas on the show, and he, not in the business, wasn't in the business, just loved wine. And he's in Texas. And he went to his local shop, and they're talking to the owners of the shop. And he goes, I'd like to do some enotourism. I'd like to tour people around the world and discuss wine. And his approach is so different than the others. And if you got to hear his podcast, because it talks about the tours he takes and the bowels of and the inspiration of the people that they meet. So it's not just showing up on a tour, going to the hotel, getting on a bus, going to a winery, talking to the guy, leaving, like most wine tourism. It's an experience. You're head deep into the wine conversation. You are not just passing through the history of this winery as another tour. You're passing through as sort of, an ambassador of where you're coming from and where you're going with your own wine experience. It's pretty interesting story. That's Bill Callejas. He's coming up in the next couple of days. And the last one I want to talk about was Jason Haas. Now, Jason Haas owns Taubless Creek, which is the partnership with Chateau Beaucastel in the Rhone. And so he's one of the first Paso Robles wineries that was growing and making Syrah, Mourvedre, and Grenache Blanc, stuff like that from Viognier, transporting the grapes of the Rhone Valley into Paso. Now, Paso, if you know, is kind of like there's a hot side and there's a cold side, a cooler side. The hot side is north of Highway 46 on the way in, where you can stop and see James Dean's crash site. And that's the hotter side, so that grows the Cabernet and those things like that. And then on the cooler side is more of the Rhone wines. Well, the point of that is his father, who not only started an incredibly famous, well-known distributor and importer called Vineyard Brands, which is still around. In fact, the first person I ever met in the wine business in 1987 was Hubert Fabre, and he was the representative for Vineyard Brands at the time. And my father introduced him to me at a tasting, and we became lifelong friends in this trade because of that meeting. But regardless, Robert Haas was part of the Rhone Rangers, they called them. And that was headed up by Randall Graham of Bonnie Doon. And they make wines that we weren't making in California at the time. And you're talking about 1980, 89, I think it was, 87, 89. And they would meet. And this is the part of the connection of the wine trade that's bizarre. They would meet at a restaurant in Berkeley. The same restaurant that Alice Waters, the famed restaurateur who started Chez Panisse, who turned food on its ear in America from Chez Panisse. Well, when she felt like leaving for lunch or dinner and not be at Chez Panisse, she went to La Lime. And La Lime was in Berkeley as well. And this is where the Rhone Rangers started, where they would meet. Big deal, Paul. Big deal. Hey, that's a really great idea, Paul. Well, that is kind of cool in itself, but let's take it a step back. The guy that owned La Lime at the time was a gentleman named Vahe Kashgarian. And you know his name because there's been a movie about him called The Cup of Salvation. He's also now making one of the most famous sparkling wines in Armenia. It's made its way to America in great volumes called Kush. He also has many other brands, but Vahe Kashgarian owned La Lime. Now, that was after his 2 stints as a winemaker and chateau, a villa owner in Italy. one in the south in Puglia and the other one in Tuscany. You want to hear his story? Wow. I just did a show with him. That's coming out soon as well. It's an incredible conversation with this guy. There's also a podcast with him, earlier days with him. But tell me that connection is not crazy good, that we're crossing over not only countries, we're crossing over cultures, we're crossing over food and wine, and that the guy that owned the restaurant where the Rhone Rangers started, and I had one of the Rhone Rangers on my show, the son of a Rhone Ranger, and now we're talking about Vahe Kashgarian making wine in Armenia. So after Lalim, in a short stint as a wine distributor in America, in California particularly, he went off got the calling to go to Armenia many years ago, and started the sparkling brand, which is now well known worldwide. So that's wine. That's what it's about. And I go back to this one comment I make almost every time I give a speech on wine. Pick 5 things that represent culture. 5 things. Language, if you have one, separate language, Armenia does. Land, if you're fortunate to still have land as a culture. Music, food, and wine. These differentiate culture from the rest of the pack. That's my rant for today. Look forward to more podcasts and shows coming up. Really great lineup coming up. Cheers.